There is a fear so ancient, so deep in the marrow of human civilization, that it predates written language itself. It is not the fear of death. It is something far worse. It is the fear of being almost dead, of lying in total darkness, wrapped in burial cloth, the wooden lid of your coffin inches above your face, and realizing, in one cold, electrifying wave of horror, that you are still alive, that no one knows, that no one is coming. For most of human history, this was not a paranoid fantasy. It happened, more often than you would ever want to know. And there was one disease, one terrifying, bewildering, merciless disease that made it happen so frequently, so reliably, in so many countries across so many centuries, that it reshaped the way entire civilizations thought about death, burial, medicine, and the very nature of the human body. It changed how we build coffins. It changed how we write wills. It changed laws, religions, architecture, and literature. It even changed the English language itself. And tonight, we are going to go all the way back to the beginning, to crowded medieval streets, to terrified Victorian physicians, to desperate inventors hammering nails into signal bells, to grieving families who heard something impossible from beneath the cold ground. Tonight, we are going to talk about the disease that made people bury themselves alive. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and whatever you do, don't go to sleep just yet. To understand why this happened, you first need to understand something fundamental about the world before modern medicine, before stethoscopes, before brain scans, before the heart monitors that beep steadily in every hospital room on Earth today. Before any of that, for most of human history, determining whether someone was truly dead was, at best, an educated guess. Think about that for a moment. Every doctor, every physician, every apothecary, every barber surgeon who ever practiced medicine in the ancient, medieval, or early modern world faced the same impossible challenge. How do you know? How do you know with absolute certainty that the person lying still before you has truly crossed the threshold from life into death, and not simply fallen into a state so profoundly deep, so completely suspended, that they merely appear to have crossed it? The honest answer, for most of recorded history, was this: you didn't. You made your best judgment and you moved on. Because there were bills to pay and other patients dying, and the body needed to be in the ground before it began to smell. And so physicians developed what they called signs of death, observable, practical indicators that a trained eye could use to make a determination. These signs included things like the absence of breathing, measured by holding a candle flame near the nostrils and watching for movement. The absence of a heartbeat, detected by pressing an ear to the chest. The cooling of the body temperature, measured by the touch of a hand. The relaxation of the muscles and the closing of the eyes. And eventually, the onset of rigor mortis, the stiffening of the joints that begins a few hours after true death. These were the tools of the trade, and for the vast majority of cases, in the vast majority of history, they worked just fine. But there was a problem. A very specific, very terrifying problem. Because there existed, in nature, in the human body, in the wild, unpredictable theatre of human illness, conditions that could replicate every single one of those signs. Conditions that could drop a person's breathing so low that no candle flame would flicker. That could slow the heart so profoundly that no ear pressed against the chest could detect it. That could cool the body and still the muscles, and drop a living human being into a state of suspended stillness so complete and so convincing that even experienced physicians, men who had spent decades at the bedside of the dying, would look at the body before them and say, with absolute confidence, This person is dead, and they would be wrong. This condition had many names across many centuries and cultures. The ancient Greeks called it catalepsis, a seizing of the body. Medieval physicians called it lethargy or the death sleep. Later doctors would call it suspended animation. And the disease that triggered it most powerfully, most frequently, and most devastatingly across the 18th and 19th centuries was a disease that swept through human civilization like a dark tide, killing millions and terrifying billions more. That disease was cholera. But that is only the beginning of the story, because cholera was only the most famous culprit. Beneath it lay a whole terrible landscape of diseases and conditions that blurred the line between life and death, and plunged both patients and physicians into a nightmare that lasted centuries. Let's start at the very beginning. The earliest written records of what we would now recognize as catalepsy, the condition most frequently associated with premature burial in the ancient world, appear in the medical texts of ancient Greece and Egypt. The Egyptians described it in their medical papyri as a kind of death that is not death, a state in which the life force, had retreated so deeply into the body that it could not be perceived from the outside. Egyptian physicians were actually quite cautious about this. Their embalming process, which we associate primarily with religious tradition, also served a surprisingly practical purpose. It guaranteed that no one was ever buried while still alive. If a person was truly in cataleptic suspension, if their spirit had merely retreated but not departed, then the first incision of the embalmer's knife would almost certainly wake them, or kill them. Either way, the problem was resolved. The ancient Greeks were both more philosophically troubled and more medically rigorous about the question. Hippocrates himself, the father of Western medicine, the man whose name is attached to the oath every doctor still takes today, wrote extensively about what he called catalepsis, a sudden, complete seizure of the body in which the patient becomes rigid, unresponsive, and cold, with breathing and heartbeat so suppressed as to be undetectable. He described patients who had lain in this state for hours, sometimes for days, and then, without warning, without any medical intervention whatsoever, simply woke up. They sat up. They blinked. They asked for water, and the physicians who had gathered around them, who had been preparing to discuss the funeral arrangements, stared at them in speechless astonishment. Hippocrates warned his students with great seriousness that they must wait, that they must observe, that the signs of death were not always what they appeared to be. But even Hippocrates did not fully understand the mechanism. He did not know why this happened. He did not know that the human body is, in fact, capable of entering states of metabolic suppression so profound that virtually every measurable sign of life can fall below the threshold of detection, and yet the person can recover completely. He just knew that it happened, and he warned his students to be careful. Unfortunately, his warning was not always heeded, because the ancient world, like every world that came after it, was governed by the relentless practical pressure of dealing with the dead. Bodies decomposed, they attracted disease, they needed to be buried, cremated, or otherwise disposed of quickly, efficiently, and without excessive sentiment. And so the stories began. Stories that have been told and retold across 2,000 years of human history. Stories of people who woke up in their tombs, who clawed at their burial wrappings, who cried out from beneath the stone slabs of mausoleums, while horrified passers-by tried to comprehend what they were hearing. Pliny the Elder, the great Roman encyclopedist, who died famously while observing the eruption of Mount Vesuvius, compiled accounts of premature burial from across the ancient world. He wrote about a man named Aviola, a Roman nobleman of considerable rank, who was pronounced dead after an illness and placed on his funeral pyre. When the fire began to burn, he regained consciousness. But by then the flames had risen too high, and the attendants, paralyzed by shock and superstition, could not pull him from the inferno. He burned alive. Pliny also recorded the case of a Roman consul named Lucius Lamia, who was similarly placed on his funeral pyre and revived, but whose attendants, perhaps having learned from stories like Aviola's, acted quickly enough to pull him free. He survived. He lived to tell the story. He probably told it many times. These are not myths. These are not fairy tales. They are historical records, written by careful and respected chroniclers who were themselves careful to distinguish between legend and documented fact. And they are only the beginning. Because as human civilization moved from the ancient world into the medieval period, the conditions for premature burial did not improve. In many ways, they got dramatically worse. Imagine a city in the grip of epidemic, not a city in the abstract, a real city, 14th century Florence, or London, or Paris, or Constantinople, a city where, in the worst weeks of the Black Death's passage, hundreds of people are dying every single day, where the gravediggers cannot keep up, where bodies are being collected by cart in the morning and dumped into mass graves by midday, where the physicians, those brave, terrified men who had not already fled to the countryside, are moving from house to house with handkerchiefs pressed to their faces, making snap judgments about who is alive and who is dead as quickly as they possibly can. Because in a city like this, in a crisis like this, there is no time for Hippocrates' careful observation. There is no time to wait. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, spread primarily by fleas on rats, killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population between 1347 and 1351, 30 to 60%. In some cities, the death rate was even higher. In certain villages, every single person died. And in the chaos of that catastrophic mortality, the protocols for determining death, such as they were, simply collapsed. Bodies were being buried in some cases within hours of the last observed signs of life. Now, here is where it gets deeply, profoundly disturbing. Because the Black Death, specifically the bubonic form of the plague, could, in some cases, induce a state of such profound physiological shutdown that a person might appear completely dead while remaining, somewhere deep in their collapsing biology, technically alive. The high fever that characterized plague infection could induce a coma-like state. The catastrophic drop in blood pressure that accompanied septicemic plague, when the infection entered the bloodstream, could reduce circulation so severely that a heartbeat became essentially undetectable without sophisticated instruments. And in the chaotic, terrified conditions of a medieval city under plague, where even the concept of a careful examination had been abandoned in favor of simple survival, some of those comatose patients were, almost certainly, buried alive. We know this not from medieval medical records, which were, in the best of times, incomplete and often contradictory, but from something far more visceral, from the plague pits themselves. When archaeologists in the 19th and 20th centuries began excavating the mass graves of medieval plague victims across Europe, they found something that initially defied explanation. In a significant number of cases, the bodies were not in the position in which they had been placed. Bodies that had been laid out flat, arms at their sides, faces up, were found lying on their stomachs, or with their arms raised above their heads, or curled into tight fetal positions. Positions that could not have been produced by the random shifting of soil or the decomposition of tissue. Positions that looked, with chilling unmistakability, like the positions of someone who had woken up, who had turned over, who had tried to push. Medieval chroniclers noticed this too. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in the Decameron, his extraordinary collection of stories framed around a group of Florentines fleeing the Black Death, described seeing bodies move, described hearing sounds from beneath freshly turned soil. Most medieval people attributed this to supernatural causes, to the restless dead, to demons, to God's punishment for the sins of humanity. They built their entire theology of the undead, vampires, revenants, those who walked between worlds, partly around the phenomenon of premature burial. The vampire who rises from his grave, the revenant who claws his way back to the surface. These are not purely imaginative creations. They are the cultural memory of something real, something witnessed, something that happened. And as the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance, and the Renaissance gave way to the scientific revolution, the scale of the problem did not diminish. It merely became, for the first time, visible, because now there were people with the tools, the vocabulary, and the courage to say, in plain language, what was happening. Now we come to the disease at the center of our story, not the Black Death, though it set the stage, not catalepsy, though it is the mechanism, but cholera, the great pandemic disease of the 19th century, the illness that swept through the world in wave after wave of devastating mortality, and that, more than any other single pathogen in history, made the fear of premature burial into something approaching a mass hysteria. To understand why cholera was so uniquely terrifying in this regard, you need to understand what cholera actually does to the human body. Cholera is caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, transmitted through contaminated water or food. When it enters the body, it begins producing a toxin that attacks the lining of the small intestine. This toxin triggers what is perhaps the most extreme diarrheal illness known to medicine. Not simply diarrhea in the familiar, uncomfortable, ultimately manageable sense. We are talking about a loss of fluid from the body so catastrophic, so rapid, so complete that a healthy adult person can lose more than 20 litres of fluid in a single day. To put that in perspective, the average human body contains roughly 5 to 6 litres of blood. When you lose that much fluid in a single day, you are not simply dehydrated, you are collapsing. Every system in your body begins to shut down simultaneously. Your blood pressure plummets, your heart rate slows, your muscle function fails, your skin becomes cold, dry and bluish, your face becomes drawn and hollow, the eyes sunken deep into the skull. Your voice drops to a whisper and then often falls silent entirely. And then, and this is the critical moment, you go still. Your breathing becomes so shallow as to be essentially imperceptible. Your heart rate drops so low that no stethoscope of the 19th century, and certainly no hand pressed to a chest, could reliably detect it. Your body temperature drops to near the ambient temperature of the room. To anyone looking at you, you appear, with absolute conviction, to be dead. But you are not necessarily, because cholera, unlike many diseases, does not always kill. Even without treatment, some patients survive. Their immune systems mount a response. Their guts begin to recover. Their fluid balance begins, impossibly, to restore itself. And when that happens, when the body begins its slow, stubborn crawl back from the edge of that physiological abyss, those patients wake up. Sometimes they wake up at home, surrounded by weeping family members who had given them up for dead. Sometimes they wake up on the preparation table of a mortician who is reaching for his instruments. And sometimes, They wake up somewhere else entirely, somewhere dark, somewhere confined, somewhere 6 feet below the surface of the earth. The first major cholera pandemic struck the world between 1817 and 1824, spreading from India across Asia, the Middle East, and East Africa. But it was the second pandemic, which began in 1829 and swept through Europe and the Americas through the 1830s, that brought the full horror of premature burial into public consciousness. Because for the first time, physicians were keeping detailed records, and the records were extraordinary. In France, which was hit catastrophically hard, Paris alone lost nearly 19,000 people in a single epidemic in 1832. Physicians began documenting cases of apparent revival, of patients who had been declared dead, prepared for burial, placed in coffins or on slabs, and who then, to the absolute stupefaction of everyone present, showed signs of life. Some of these revivals happened at the last possible moment, literally as the coffin lid was being nailed shut. Some happened in the cemetery, during the funeral procession itself, and some, and these are the ones that haunt the historical record most powerfully, were discovered only afterward, when a grave was opened for some secondary reason, and found to contain someone who had clearly, desperately, and unsuccessfully tried to get out. The Russian physician, Pyotr Pletnyov, who treated patients during the 1831 cholera epidemic, described in his memoirs finding coffins that had been disturbed from the inside. A French physician named Jossat, writing in 1854 in the aftermath of the third cholera pandemic, estimated, based on his own clinical observations and those of his colleagues, that premature burial occurred in perhaps 1 in every 1,000 cholera deaths in major European cities. 1 in 1,000 might not sound like a large number, until you consider that the third cholera pandemic alone killed somewhere between 1 and 2 million people across Europe. Do the math. The numbers are staggering. And the most terrifying part of all of this is not even the burial itself. It is the awareness. Because cholera, while it mimics death with extraordinary fidelity, does not always suppress consciousness along with the vital signs. Some patients, and these accounts appear again and again in the medical literature of the period, were fully conscious during the period of apparent death. They could hear, they could feel, they could smell. They simply could not move, could not speak, could not signal in any way that they were aware of what was happening to them. They lay there, aware, while physicians examined them and declared them dead, while their families wept over them, while their bodies were washed and dressed and laid out, while they were placed in their coffins, while the lid was closed, while the darkness swallowed everything. The medical term for this condition, the retention of consciousness within a body that appears and functions as though dead, is locked in awareness during catalepsy. The historical term, used by physicians and lay people alike in the Victorian era, was far more evocative. They called it the living death. And the world was about to undergo a profound and lasting transformation in how it thought about that living death. A transformation driven not by science alone, but by fear. Before we go deeper into the medical horrors, let me take a moment to do something that bedtime history does best. Let me tell you a story. Because the fear of premature burial didn't just generate medical reforms and horror literature. It generated something that every single one of you uses every single day without ever thinking about where it came from. It generated language. Specifically, it generated several expressions in English that have become so thoroughly embedded in everyday speech that their origins have been completely forgotten. Let's start with one you almost certainly know. The phrase, "saved by the bell." Today, we use this expression to mean rescued from a difficult situation at the last possible moment. It comes from boxing, right? The bell at the end of a round saving a fighter who's in trouble. Actually, that's one theory. But there's another origin story, and it's considerably darker. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as the fear of premature burial reached its peak, inventors and undertakers across Europe began marketing what they called security coffins, specially designed burial cases that included a mechanism allowing someone who woke up inside to signal for help. The most common mechanism was a bell. A long cord or chain ran from inside the coffin, up through the earth, to a small bell mounted on a post above the grave. If the occupant of the coffin woke up, they could pull the cord. The bell would ring, and someone, a cemetery watchman, whose entire job existed because of this fear, would hear it, locate the grave, and begin the process of digging them out. The person inside the coffin would have been saved by the bell. Now, linguists are somewhat divided on whether this is the true origin of the phrase. The boxing explanation has its advocates, but the security coffin story is historically accurate. The bells were real, the cemetery watchmen were real, and the phrase does appear in the written record in ways that suggest familiarity with the burial practice. Here is another one. The graveyard shift. Today, this simply means the night shift, working from midnight to dawn, the hours most people would prefer to be asleep. But why graveyard? Again, the cemetery watchman. In Victorian England and America, cemeteries employed workers specifically to listen for the bells mounted on security coffins. Someone had to be there through the night hours, walking the paths between the graves, listening for the impossible sound of a bell ringing from below the earth. This was the graveyard shift, the overnight duty of watching the dead to see if any of them woke up. And then there's perhaps the most chilling of all, the expression, dead ringer. Today, it simply means someone who bears an uncanny resemblance to someone else. We use it constantly, but its original meaning was far more literal. A dead ringer was someone, a living person, who pulled the bell cord from inside a security coffin. A ringer was, in 18th century slang, something that passes itself off as something else, a counterfeit. A horse ringer was a substitute horse entered into a race under a different name. By extension, a dead ringer was a dead person who turned out not to be dead at all, someone who rang the bell to prove it. These expressions are not just linguistic curiosities. They are evidence of something profound. They are evidence of how deeply the fear of premature burial had penetrated the consciousness of ordinary people in the 18th and 19th centuries. This was not a fringe obsession. This was not the province of the eccentric or the morbid. This was a fear so widespread, so socially accepted, so normalized by the constant drumbeat of real documented cases, that it left its mark in the very fabric of the English language. And the real documented cases were extraordinary. Let me tell you about some of them. The historical record of premature burial is enormous. Tens of thousands of pages of medical testimony, newspaper accounts, court records, and personal memoirs accumulated across several centuries and catalogued with obsessive care by a handful of Victorian physicians who made it their life's work to document the scope of the problem. Of all these cases, I want to tell you about 5 in particular, not because they are the most dramatic, but because they are the most thoroughly documented, the most historically verified, and the most revealing of the true nature of what people were experiencing. Victorine Labroue was a 23-year-old seamstress in Paris when the cholera epidemic of 1832 struck the city. She fell ill in early June. Within 3 days, She was in what her physician described as a state indistinguishable from death. No detectable pulse, no visible breathing, skin cold and grey, eyes fixed and unresponsive. She was declared dead. Her family, themselves terrified of cholera and anxious to limit their exposure to the body, arranged for a rapid burial. In Paris during the epidemic, bodies were often buried within 24 hours of death, or even sooner. Victorine was placed in a coffin, and the coffin was taken to the cimetière du Père Lachaise. She was in the ground for approximately 6 hours when the gravediggers, returning to complete another interment nearby, heard something. A scratching sound, coming from below. The men stopped working. They looked at each other. One of them said quietly that it must be an animal, a mole, or perhaps a rat. But then the scratching came again, more distinct, more urgent. They dug. The story of what happened when they opened the coffin varies slightly between different historical sources, but the core details are consistent. Victorine was alive. Her fingernails were broken and bloody from where she had been scratching at the inside of the coffin lid. She was breathing, shallowly, rapidly, and her eyes were open. She was taken to the Hôtel Dieu hospital, where she recovered fully within several weeks. Her case was documented in the French medical journal Gazette Médicale de Paris and became one of the most cited examples in the great 19th century debate about premature burial. The second case comes from Germany in the autumn of 1792. The Reverend Johann Christoph Schwarz was a Lutheran minister in a small German village when he collapsed during a church service. He was found to be pulseless, breathless, and cold. His congregation, naturally, were devastated. Their pastor was dead. Arrangements were made for a funeral. It was only when the women of the congregation came to dress his body for burial, washing it, combing his hair, folding his hands across his chest in the proper posture for death, that one of them noticed something. His chest was moving, barely, almost imperceptibly, but it was moving. A physician was summoned immediately. He confirmed with evident astonishment that the Reverend Schwarz was alive, though barely. His pulse was so faint as to be almost unmeasurable, his breathing so shallow that it could only be detected by placing a mirror beneath his nostrils and watching for the faintest cloud of condensation. The physician diagnosed him with catalepsy, a severe episode triggered, he believed, by the profound emotional and physical stress of ministry, combined with what appears, from the description of his symptoms, to have been a significant cardiac event. The Reverend Schwarz recovered. He returned to his ministry, and for the rest of his life, he refused to have a closed casket at anyone's funeral, insisting, at every burial service he conducted, that the coffin remain open until the absolute last possible moment before the grave was filled. The third case is remarkable not because of the revival itself, but because of what the patient later described about her experience during the period of apparent death. Anne-Marie Bobin was a 51-year-old Belgian woman who collapsed and was declared dead following what her physicians described as a nervous crisis, a diagnosis that, in the late 19th century, covered an enormous range of conditions, including severe epileptic episodes, catatonic states, and what we would now recognize as massive psychological trauma responses. She was unconscious for approximately 14 hours before being declared dead. She was placed on her bed and her family gathered for a wake, the traditional vigil of the dead that was still practiced widely in Catholic Belgium at this time. Approximately 4 hours into the wake, Madame Bobin sat up. The screaming, by several accounts, was considerable. She was hospitalized. She recovered completely, But what makes her case historically extraordinary is the written account she later gave to her physician, who published it in the Belgian Medical Review in 1896. Madame Bobin described, with remarkable clarity, the experience of lying apparently dead while fully conscious. She wrote, "I heard everything. I heard my daughters weeping. I heard my husband speaking to the priest. I heard the priest speaking last rites over me. I could smell the candles they had lit around my bed. I felt the cold of the room and the weight of the sheet they had placed over my face. I could not move. I could not speak. I could not even open my eyes. It was as though every connection between my mind and my body had been severed, and I was a prisoner inside myself, watching from a great distance. The most terrible moment was when I felt my husband take my hand to say goodbye. I tried with everything in me to squeeze his fingers. I could not even by a fraction. I do not know how long this lasted. It felt like days. It may have been hours." This account, this single, extraordinary first-person description of conscious experience during apparent death, galvanized the medical community and the reading public when it was published, because it confirmed what many physicians had long suspected but feared to state in public. That premature burial was not merely the experience of waking up in a coffin. It could be the experience of lying there, aware, during every step of the process that led to that coffin. The fourth case involves a retired British Army officer named Edward Crompton, who had served in India and who was well acquainted with the particular horrors of cholera. He had watched it decimate regiments during his service on the subcontinent. He contracted the disease in the winter of 1856 during a cholera outbreak in the north of England, and was declared dead by his personal physician after a brief and catastrophic illness. He was placed in a coffin in his study while his family prepared for the funeral. He regained consciousness approximately 12 hours later. The specific detail that makes Colonel Crompton's case memorable is what he did immediately upon waking. He went to his solicitor. He had a codicil added to his will stipulating, in extraordinarily precise legal language, the conditions under which his funeral could proceed. A minimum wait of 48 hours following the declaration of death, during which time his body was to be kept at a temperature no lower than 60 degrees Fahrenheit and examined at 6-hour intervals for signs of life. He also required that a cord be placed in his hand at the moment of his eventual burial, a cord connected to a bell above his grave, and then he went home. He outlived his physician by 11 years. Colonel Crompton's legal precautions were not unusual for the period. He was one of thousands of people across Victorian Britain and Europe who added such stipulations to their wills following actual or feared experiences of near premature burial. The fifth case comes from the earlier period, before cholera, before the Victorian era, and it is documented not in a medical journal, but in the city records of Florence. A woman described only as a wife of the merchant class died, or appeared to die, during an epidemic of typhus fever in Florence in the winter of 1709. She was buried in the family chapel beneath the church of Santa Croce. 14 days later, the sexton of the church was in the crypt for unrelated maintenance when he heard something. He described it, in his written report to the church authorities, as a soft sound, like a voice speaking from beneath water, but unmistakably the sound of a human being in distress. The vault was opened. The woman inside was dead, but her position had changed dramatically from how she had been placed, and on the stone floor of the vault, near the door, scraped in the dust, were 2 words, in Italian, "Ero viva," I was alive. She had survived long enough to move, to crawl toward the sealed door, and to scratch those 2 words into the dust before the end came. Ero viva. I was alive. If there is a single image from this entire story that I want you to carry with you, that I think most perfectly captures the full weight of what we're talking about, it is those two words, scratched by dying fingers into the dust of a sealed stone vault. Ero viva. By the mid-19th century, the fear of premature burial had escaped the confines of medical literature and entered the mainstream of popular culture. Newspapers across Europe and America ran stories about near premature burials with a frequency that, from a modern perspective, seems almost sensationalist. But it was not sensationalism that drove this coverage. It was genuine, documented, repeated occurrence. Between 1850 and 1900, the major newspapers of Britain, France, Germany, and the United States published literally hundreds of first-hand accounts of people who had revived after being declared dead, many of them at the last possible moment before burial. The German physician Johann Jakob Wepfer compiled a collection of verified cases that ran to several volumes. The French physician Alexandre Brière de Boismont published detailed studies of what he called apparent death, arguing that the condition was far more common than the medical establishment wanted to acknowledge. And in America, a physician named Gustavus Richard Vondersmith published, in 1899, a study that he claimed demonstrated premature burial occurring in a measurable percentage of all deaths in urban American cities. His methodology was disputed, his conclusions were argued over passionately, but the fact that they were argued over at all, in medical journals, in popular magazines, in the halls of Parliament and Congress, tells you everything you need to know about the cultural moment. This was real. This was happening. And the medical establishment was deeply, fundamentally uncomfortable about what that meant, because the implication was uncomfortable. The implication was that medicine, for all its advances, for all the stethoscopes and ophthalmoscopes and blood pressure cuffs and thermometers that the 19th century had produced, was still, at its most fundamental level, uncertain about the most fundamental question. The question of whether a person was dead. Not just probably dead, actually dead. And into that uncertainty, like water into a crack in stone, poured the terror. The terror expressed itself in remarkable ways. Wealthy people began commissioning elaborate security measures for their own eventual burials. Some built elaborate above-ground mausoleums rather than below-ground graves, reasoning that at least they would not have 6 feet of earth between them and rescue. Some specified in their wills that their bodies be kept for a minimum of several days before any burial took place. Some requested that a physician cut an artery before burial, a certain and absolute verification of death. Some requested cremation, not out of any philosophical or environmental preference, but specifically because cremation guaranteed that whatever happened, no one who was still alive would be surviving inside a cremated urn. And some of them, the ones with money and the ones with connections to the small but growing industry of funerary innovation, purchased security coffins. They were, depending on your perspective, either geniuses or madmen. They were the inventors of the 19th century's most peculiar technological niche, the safety coffin industry. And their creations were extraordinary. The idea of building special safeguards into coffins was not new. There are references to locking mechanisms on stone sarcophagi in ancient Rome that some archaeologists believe may have been intended to allow exit as well as prevent unauthorized entry. But it was the 19th century, with its combination of industrial manufacturing capability, widespread fear of premature burial, and the very particular Victorian genius for solving any problem, no matter how ghoulish, with mechanical ingenuity. It was the 19th century that turned the safety coffin into a genuine industry. The patents were astounding. The simplest and most widespread design involved a cord attached to the hand or hands of the buried person, running up through a pipe driven through the earth to a flag or bell above ground. This design was elegant, cheap, and practical. It was also widely adopted by cemeteries across Europe, particularly in Germany, where the concept of apparent death was taken especially seriously by both physicians and the public. Some German cemeteries in the mid-19th century had entire fields equipped with these signal systems, maintained by full-time watchmen whose sole responsibility was to listen for bells and watch for moving flags. The Cologne cemetery, for example, employed 6 such watchmen in the 1850s, working in rotating shifts to ensure that the graves were monitored around the clock. But the most sophisticated of the 19th century safety coffin designs was patented in 1897 by Count Michel de Karnicki, a Russian nobleman who had witnessed, as a young man attending a burial in Belgium, something that he could never fully describe without his voice breaking. A young girl who had been declared dead and placed in her coffin was, during the burial service, seen to move. By the time anyone could react, by the time the coffin had been opened, she was dead. Not from her original illness, from suffocation inside the sealed coffin. The Count spent the next several decades of his life trying to ensure that what he had witnessed never happened again. His safety coffin system worked as follows. A hollow tube, 4 inches in diameter and several feet long, was driven down from the surface of the grave to the chest of the buried person. Inside this tube was a glass ball resting on the chest. The ball sat on a long spring-loaded rod. If the person buried woke up and drew breath, even a single small breath, the rising and falling of their chest would shift the glass ball, which would release the spring-loaded rod, which would in turn set off a cascade of mechanical actions above ground. A flag would rise above the grave, visible from a distance. A bell would begin to ring. A lamp would ignite automatically, visible at night. And a small air vent would open, allowing fresh air to flow down into the coffin, giving the revived person something to breathe while help was summoned. The system was demonstrated at a Brussels medical conference in 1897 and received an enthusiastic reception. Several hundred were sold. Whether any of them were ever activated by an actual revived burial is unknown. But the mere fact of their existence, the fact that there was a commercial market for such devices, that people were spending real money on them, that inventors were devoting years of their professional lives to perfecting them, tells you something profound about the cultural temperature of the age. In America, the approach was often even more dramatic. Several American inventors patented what they called waiting vaults, above-ground structures, heated and ventilated, in which the recently deceased would be held for a mandatory observation period before any final burial took place. The waiting vault at the Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, had special chambers designed for this purpose, each equipped with attendant bells and with a glass window through which the occupant could be observed. In Cincinnati, a physician named Harlow advocated for what he called the Hospital of the Dead, a dedicated facility staffed by medical professionals, where every body would be held for a minimum of 72 hours and monitored for signs of revival before any funeral could take place. His proposal was not adopted, but the fact that it was considered, that it was debated in city council chambers and in the pages of the Cincinnati Daily Gazette, speaks to how seriously the problem was being taken. Perhaps the most poignant of all the safety coffin designs was a German patent filed in 1897, almost completely forgotten by history. It was a coffin equipped with a speaking tube, later updated to a primitive telephone connection. The idea was simple. If you woke up in your coffin, you could speak into the tube, and a listener at the surface would hear you. The patent drawing, preserved in the German Patent Office archives, shows a neat, well-crafted device, professional, sensible, almost ordinary. And yet there is something about it. Something about the image of a coffin with a telephone that stops you cold. Because what would you say? If you found yourself in that darkness with that device at your lips, what words would come out of you? Help. That's what you would say. Please, help me. I'm in here. I'm alive. Please. No account of the fear of premature burial would be complete without visiting the writers, because the literary response to this terror was extraordinary. Not because writers invented it, not because they exaggerated it, but because they recognized in it something that spoke to deeper fears than the merely physical. The fear of being buried alive is, at its core, the fear of being misunderstood, of being present but invisible, of screaming into a void that receives no echo, of being dismissed by the people who love you most at the moment of your greatest need. And so, the greatest writers of the 19th century were drawn to it with the irresistible pull of a wound that will not stop asking to be examined. No writer in history has engaged with this theme more obsessively, more brilliantly, or more personally than Edgar Allan Poe. Poe wrote about premature burial repeatedly across his career, in ways that make it clear the subject was not merely a literary device for him, but a genuine, lived terror. His story, The Premature Burial, published in 1844, is the most direct engagement, a story told in first person by a man who suffers from catalepsy and who is consumed by the fear that one of his episodes will be mistaken for death. The narrator describes the condition with a clinical precision that suggests Poe had done real research. To be buried while alive is, beyond question, the most terrific of these extremes which has ever fallen to the lot of mere mortality. That it has frequently, very frequently, so fallen will scarcely be denied by those who think. The story goes through a catalogue of verified historical cases that were, at the time, drawn from real medical literature, before delivering its own terrifying conclusion. But Poe's engagement with the theme goes far deeper than that single story. The Fall of the House of Usher is, at its heart, a story about premature burial, the entombment of Madeline Usher, the sounds from beneath the vault, the return of someone who was declared dead. Berenice involves the extraction of teeth from a cataleptic woman. Morella involves a woman who dies and is entombed, and whose presence is felt to continue. Ligeia involves a woman who dies, is buried, and, in one of the most chilling endings in all of literature, returns. Poe himself is believed to have suffered from cataleptic episodes, periods of apparent unconsciousness that he could not explain and that terrified him. Some biographers have suggested that his famous mysterious death in Baltimore in 1849, found delirious in a gutter, dying in circumstances that have never been fully explained, may itself have been related to a disease-induced cataleptic episode that was mismanaged or simply not understood. Whether or not that is true, the fear was real, and the literature it generated was extraordinary. The author of The Woman in White, one of the greatest sensation novels in English literary history, was equally obsessed. Wilkie Collins suffered from gout throughout much of his adult life, and the combination of his chronic illness and his voracious reading in medical literature made him acutely aware of the problem of premature burial. He kept, throughout his adult life, a card in his breast pocket. The card read, in precise and unambiguous language, "I am not dead. Please wait a minimum of 48 hours before burial." He instructed his household staff to ensure that the card was placed on his body immediately upon his death, or apparent death. He also put instructions in his will requiring that his body be held for a minimum of 3 days, kept at a constant temperature, and examined at regular intervals. Collins did not die in a cataleptic state, but he spent the last decades of his life convinced that he might, and he took every practical precaution available to him to ensure that if it happened, he would be found in time. The beloved Danish author of fairy tales, The Little Mermaid, Thumbelina, The Ugly Duckling, suffered from one of the most severe and well-documented cases of premature burial anxiety in the literary record. Hans Christian Andersen was terrified, with a depth that went beyond ordinary phobia, that he would be buried alive. He kept a note on his bedside table every night of his adult life. The note read, "I only appear to be dead." He also instructed his servants that if he was ever found unconscious or apparently dead, they were to cut a vein before any burial arrangements were made. Andersen's fairy tales, beneath their charming surfaces, are saturated with images of suspended life, of figures who sleep too deeply, who are trapped in ice or glass or stone, who cannot speak or move or be heard, who wait for rescue in a state between life and death. Snow White in her glass coffin, Sleeping Beauty under her enchanted sleep, the Little Mermaid trapped in a form that cannot communicate what she feels. These stories are not merely charming fiction, they are the cultural expression of a very real fear, a fear that Hans Christian Andersen shared with millions of his contemporaries and processed through the only medium he truly trusted, the fairy tale. The great French novelist Honoré de Balzac was so terrified of premature burial that he specified in his will that his veins be cut before burial. He also, according to some accounts, kept a loaded pistol by his bed, not to harm himself, but to be fired by whoever discovered him in an apparent death, on the theory that the sound of the gunshot might revive him from any cataleptic state. Whether this is apocryphal or historical fact is uncertain, but the fact that it is told about Balzac, and believed, tells you everything about the cultural moment in which he lived. By the final decades of the 19th century, the medical profession could no longer ignore the problem. The newspaper stories kept coming, the legal cases kept appearing, the inventions kept being patented, the literary works kept being published, the public kept demanding answers, and so the physicians entered the debate with full force. On one side were those, the majority of the established medical profession, who argued that premature burial was vastly exaggerated, that the documented cases, while real, represented statistical outliers rather than a systemic problem, that the fear itself was a greater threat to public health than the actual phenomenon. On the other side were a smaller but increasingly organized group of reformers who argued that the medical profession's methods for determining death were fundamentally dangerously inadequate, and that thousands of people were being buried alive every year as a result. The debate was bitter, it was public. It was conducted in medical journals, in parliamentary chambers, in newspapers, in pamphlets. William Tebb was a British social reformer. He had already made his name campaigning against compulsory smallpox vaccination. When he turned his attention, in the 1880s, to the problem of premature burial. He was not himself a physician, but he was an extraordinarily effective organizer and propagandist. In 1896, Tebb founded the London Society for the Prevention of Premature Burial, a pressure group that lobbied Parliament for legal protections against premature burial, educated the public about the risks, and compiled one of the most extensive databases of documented premature burial cases in the historical record. The database, which Tebb published in a book titled Premature Burial and How It May Be Prevented in 1896, contained over 219 verified cases of premature burial or near premature burial drawn from medical literature, court records, and eyewitness testimony. 219 cases, verified, with sources. The book caused a sensation. It was reviewed in every major British newspaper. It was debated in Parliament. It led directly to legislative changes in several English municipalities regarding the mandatory waiting periods before burial. In Germany, the response was even more comprehensive. The Prussian government, responding to sustained public pressure and the documented evidence of cholera-related premature burials, enacted legislation in 1871 requiring that all deaths be certified by a licensed physician and that bodies be held in municipal corpse houses for a mandatory waiting period before burial. These facilities were specially designed with attendant bells, ventilation systems, and full-time observers whose job was to watch the bodies for signs of revival. Each chamber was connected to a central monitoring room by strings attached to the hands and feet of the bodies inside. Any movement would immediately alert the attendant. The waiting period was typically 4 days. In that time, approximately 1 in every 1,000 bodies showed signs of revival. 1 in 1,000. In a city the size of Munich, with its mortality rate that translated to several genuine cases of apparent death being caught and reversed every single year. The German waiting mortuaries were, in many ways, the most humane and rational response to the problem of premature burial that the 19th century produced. But they also revealed, with uncomfortable clarity, just how real the problem was. One of the lasting legacies of the premature burial debate was the gradual professionalization and standardization of the death certification process. Before the mid-19th century, in most countries, a death could be declared and a burial authorized by almost anyone with a minimal claim to authority: a parish priest, a local magistrate, a physician who had never even seen the deceased. The combination of epidemic disease, the premature burial panic, and the rise of public health infrastructure gradually changed this. Britain's Births and Deaths Registration Act of 1836 required that all deaths be registered with a local registrar, creating for the first time a systematic national record of mortality. Subsequent legislation progressively tightened the requirements for what constituted adequate evidence of death before a burial could proceed. These legal reforms, designed primarily to combat the premature burial risk, had a secondary effect that proved enormously valuable. They created the infrastructure of vital statistics that modern public health, epidemiology, and demography are built upon. The fear of premature burial, in other words, gave us some of the foundational tools of modern medicine. It also, indirectly, drove the development of new diagnostic technologies. The stethoscope, invented by René Laennec in 1816, was immediately recognized as a potentially valuable tool for detecting the faint heartbeat of a cataleptic patient. The ophthalmoscope, developed in the 1850s, allowed physicians to examine the retina of the eye, which, in true death, shows characteristic changes that are absent in catalepsy. Electrical stimulation, the application of a galvanic current to the body to test for muscle response, was developed and used specifically as a test for true death versus apparent death. And the simple, elegant technique of placing a mirror beneath the nostrils, watching for condensation that indicates breathing, was codified as a standard practice precisely because of the documented cases of premature burial. Modern medicine's understanding of the boundary between life and death was, in large part, hammered into shape on the anvil of the premature burial crisis. We have focused primarily on cholera as the disease most associated with premature burial. But cholera was only the most famous member of a much larger group of conditions that created this danger. Pure catalepsy, the neurological condition in which the body becomes rigid and all voluntary movement ceases, is perhaps the oldest contributor to the premature burial record. True cataleptic episodes can last for hours, or even, in extreme cases, for days. The breathing and heartbeat are slowed, though rarely to the degree seen in cholera. The patient is typically unconscious, but can sometimes retain awareness. Like cholera, typhus fever can drive the body into a state of extreme physiological suppression. The high fever associated with severe typhus can induce coma, and the collapse of blood pressure in late-stage typhus can make the pulse essentially undetectable. Typhus is transmitted by lice and was historically associated with overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Prisons, ships, army camps, and the poorest urban slums. Severe epileptic seizures, particularly in the 19th century when they were poorly understood and treated, could leave patients in a post-ictal state so profound as to be indistinguishable from death to an untrained observer. Several of the documented cases of near premature burial in the historical record involve people subsequently identified as epileptics, people whose episodes of apparent death were actually the post-seizure recovery state. Catatonic schizophrenia involves periods of complete motor immobility. The patient becomes rigid, unresponsive, and mute, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. In the 19th century, before schizophrenia was identified as a specific disease, catatonic episodes were frequently misinterpreted as either supernatural possession or death. Opium was the most widely used drug of the 19th century and was available without prescription in Britain and America for most of the Victorian period. Opium overdose can produce profound respiratory depression, slowing breathing to levels that may be undetectable by simple observation, as well as loss of consciousness and the cold bluish skin that, combined with motionlessness, creates a convincing death presentation. And the cold water associated with drowning, particularly in the cold rivers and seas of northern Europe, could induce a state of protective hypothermia that dramatically slowed all metabolic processes, including breathing and heart rate. People pulled from cold water who appeared dead were sometimes not dead, and without modern resuscitation techniques, their chances of recovery depended almost entirely on how quickly they were recognized as potentially alive. The fear of premature burial did not simply disappear. It faded, gradually, unevenly, never quite completely, over the course of the early 20th century. The development of municipal water purification systems in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, driven directly by the public health catastrophe of repeated cholera epidemics, dramatically reduced the incidence of cholera in Western countries. Fewer cholera deaths meant fewer cholera patients entering the terrifying physiological state that had powered so many premature burial cases. Clean water killed cholera, and by killing cholera, it killed much of the immediate practical driver of the premature burial crisis. The invention and widespread adoption of increasingly sensitive diagnostic instruments, better stethoscopes, electrocardiographs, finally, the EEG for measuring brain activity, gave physicians tools for determining death that were far beyond anything available to their 19th century predecessors. The electrocardiograph, in particular, was transformative. The electrical activity of the heart, measured and displayed in real time, provided an objective, unambiguous record of cardiac function, or its absence. No doctor examining an ECG trace can mistake the flat line of cardiac death for the barely perceptible beat of a cataleptic patient. The machine makes the distinction that human senses could not. The widespread adoption of embalming in American funeral practice had an unexpected secondary effect on the premature burial question. Embalming, which involves draining the blood from the body and replacing it with preservative chemicals, is an absolutely reliable method of ensuring that no embalmed body could possibly be alive. And in 1968, an ad hoc committee at Harvard Medical School published a landmark report that redefined death in terms of irreversible cessation of all brain function, not merely the cessation of breathing and heartbeat. This redefinition was driven partly by the emerging technology of mechanical ventilation, which could keep a body breathing and a heart beating long after any meaningful possibility of recovery had passed. But it was also the culmination of centuries of medical, philosophical, and cultural wrestling with the question of where exactly the line between life and death is drawn. The Harvard criteria gave medicine, for the first time in history, a genuinely reliable and scientifically defensible definition of death. And with that definition came the tools, the EEG, the cerebral blood flow studies, the specific neurological tests, to verify it with certainty. A body that meets the Harvard brain death criteria cannot be revived, cannot wake up, cannot scratch at a coffin lid, cannot ring a bell. The long, terrible age of uncertainty was over. Almost. I said almost. Because while modern medicine has essentially solved the technical problem of determining death with certainty, the fear itself has never fully departed. And occasionally, frighteningly, the modern world throws up cases that remind us that the gap between apparent death and true death has not entirely closed. In 2014, Janina Kolkiewicz, a 91-year-old Polish woman, was declared dead by her physician following what appeared to be cardiac arrest. She was placed in a body bag and sent to the local funeral home. 11 hours later, the funeral home workers discovered that the body bag was moving. Mrs. Kolkiewicz was alive. She had been in a hypothermic cardiac arrest, a state in which her heart had stopped and her body temperature had dropped so dramatically that all measurable signs of life had disappeared, but in which the extreme cold had protected her brain and major organs from irreversible damage. She was taken to hospital. She recovered. She reportedly asked for hot soup and pancakes. In 2007, Carlos Camejo, a 33-year-old Venezuelan man, was declared dead following a severe traffic accident. He was taken to the morgue, where an autopsy was begun. He woke up during the procedure. The first indication that something was wrong came when the medical examiner made an incision, and the body bled significantly more than a dead body should. The examiner looked closer. Camejo opened his eyes. He was taken to hospital. He recovered. In 2014, in Lexington County, Mississippi, Walter Williams, a 78-year-old man, was declared dead by a hospice nurse and a coroner. He was placed in a body bag. He was transported to a funeral home. He was placed on an embalming table. He was alive. He moved. He kicked. He breathed. Walter Williams was taken to hospital and lived for several more weeks before dying of natural causes. These cases are vanishingly rare in the modern world, where diagnostic technology is sophisticated and protocols are rigorous. But they are not impossible. And they are a reminder that the boundary between life and death, while now far better mapped than it was in the age of cholera, is not always a bright line. It is sometimes a gradient, a place of uncertainty, a territory that medicine has mapped far more precisely than it once could, but that still, at the edges, holds surprises. I want to spend a moment, before we come to our close, considering what all of this has actually given us. Because the story of premature burial is not only a story of terror and suffering, it is a story of how human beings respond to an impossible challenge, of how fear, when it is justified and acknowledged rather than suppressed, can drive genuine progress. Consider what the fear of premature burial gave to the world. It gave us the standardization of the death certificate. the document that tracks every death in modern society and provides the foundation of our public health data. It gave us the municipal water system, the clean water infrastructure that eliminated cholera from the Western world and has saved literally hundreds of millions of lives since. It gave us the waiting mortuary, which evolved into the modern morgue. It gave us the drive for more sensitive and accurate diagnostic instruments. Instruments that became the stethoscope, the electrocardiograph, the electroencephalograph, the cerebral blood flow scanner. It gave us the concept of brain death, perhaps the most important advance in our understanding of the biology of dying that any century has produced. And it gave us resuscitation science, the Society for the Recovery of Persons, apparently drowned, founded in Amsterdam in 1767 and in London in 1774, which later became the Royal Humane Society, was the first organisation in history devoted to the science of resuscitation. Its founding was directly motivated by the premature burial debate. Its techniques evolved into modern cardiopulmonary resuscitation, and it has saved, in its various forms, millions of lives since its founding. The disease that made people bury themselves alive, and the centuries of fear it generated, gave us, in the end, the tools to save people who would otherwise have died. There is something profound in that. Something almost unbearably human. The worst of what we fear becomes the engine of the best of what we build. Before we close, I want to try to make this real, not in the abstract, not as history, but as the individual human experience that it was, because it is easy, it is seductively, comfortingly easy to engage with this material at a distance, to think about cases and documented instances and statistical frequencies. It is much harder to sit with the reality of what those numbers represent. Let me tell you what it was like. You are sick. You have been sick for 3 days. Perhaps it is cholera. Perhaps you are in a city that has been stricken by epidemic, where the water in the wells has gone bad and the streets are full of the sound of grief. You are in your bed. Your family is around you. The physician has come. He has shaken his head. He has told them quietly, in the hall outside your room, that the prognosis is not good. And then the collapse comes. It is not painful, or not specifically so. It is more like a vast retreating, like a tide going out from a shore. Everything that was present and immediate and physical about your existence begins to recede, and then you are still. Your breathing has dropped to a whisper. Your heart is beating. You can feel it dimly as a faint flutter somewhere in your chest. But it is so slow, so faint, that the physician who presses his ear to your chest cannot hear it. Your body is cooling. Your skin is the colour of candle wax. To anyone looking at you, you are dead. But you are not. You can hear your daughter crying in the corner. You can hear your husband speaking to the physician in a low, strained voice. You can feel the specific weight of your body on the mattress. Each pressure point, each surface contact. You cannot move. Not your fingers, not your toes, not your eyelids, not your lips. You try to speak. The muscles that form words are not responding. The breath that should carry speech into the room is too shallow to carry anything. You are completely, absolutely paralyzingly present in a body that has decided to lie. The hours pass. You hear the preparations, the sound of water in a basin, the smell of soap, hands moving your limbs, gently, carefully, with the tender efficiency of grief. You are being washed, you are being dressed, you feel the fabric, you feel the care, and you cannot tell them. You cannot say, I am here, I am inside this. Please wait. Please. There are no words for what it is to be present in that moment. And then, perhaps, the coffin, the specific weight of the lid, the sound of the wood settling, the darkness, not darkness like a dark room where there is still the memory of light, darkness like the bottom of the ocean, complete and encompassing and absolute. And then the sound of the earth, that sound, that particular sound of soil falling on wood, a sound that, once heard in imagination, can never quite be unheard. I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you this because I think it is important, genuinely important, to understand what those historical cases represent at the level of the individual human being who lived them. Some of them were never found. Some of them rang no bell. Some of them left no dust-scratch message. They simply were there, in the dark, and then they were not. Those are the ones we cannot count, the ones who left no trace beyond the epidemiological inference, the disturbed position in the archaeological record, the inexplicable evidence of a body that moved after it should no longer have been capable of moving. But the ones we can count, the ones who were found in time, who lived to tell their stories, who wrote their accounts in medical journals and memoirs and letters to physicians, they matter. Victorine Lebrun with her broken nails, the Reverend Schwartz, who changed how he conducted funerals for the rest of his life, Madame Bobin, who wrote that her greatest terror was feeling her husband take her hand in farewell, the Italian woman of Florence, who scratched 2 words into the dust of a sealed vault. Ero viva. I was alive. Those people matter. And the civilization that responded to their stories, that was horrified enough and motivated enough and human enough to change its laws, its architecture, its medical practices, and eventually its science in response to them. That civilization deserves credit, not full credit. The response was imperfect and in many ways inadequate. But it was a response. It was the beginning of the long, still incomplete project of understanding death well enough to be sure, really, genuinely sure, that the person in the coffin is not still capable of saying, I am alive. I am here. Please wait. There is a detail I haven't mentioned yet. When the security coffin industry peaked in the 1890s, when the bells and the flags and the spring-loaded systems were at their most widespread, some cemetery designers in Germany and Austria built their waiting areas with a very particular feature. Above each grave where a signal system had been installed, they planted flowers. Specific flowers. Flowers that bloomed in the spring, when the ground thawed and the risk of cataleptic survival seemed somehow both highest and most hopeful. The choice of flower varied by region and by cemetery, but many chose the same thing. They chose forget-me-nots. Small, blue, insistent, persistent, growing above the places where the living dead waited to be remembered. Forget-me-not, perhaps the most human 2 words in any language. The prayer not to be abandoned, not to be dismissed, not to be misread as gone when you are still, somewhere deep inside, very much present. Forget-me-not. The disease that made people bury themselves alive is mostly behind us now. The cholera that swept through cities of the 19th century is largely conquered in the developed world, contained by the clean water systems it ironically helped inspire. The diagnostic tools that now accompany every death in a modern hospital, the electrocardiograph flatline, the brain death protocol, the trained eye of the forensic pathologist, make true premature burial in those settings essentially impossible. We have, in the centuries since Victorine Lebrun clawed at her coffin lid, develop genuinely reliable ways of knowing. But the human biology that made the disease so terrifying, the capacity of the human body to enter states of profound suspended stillness that can fool even careful observers, has not changed. The body is still capable of its old tricks. The border between life and death is still at the edges, not perfectly bright. And the fear, that ancient, deep-marrow fear, has not entirely departed. It lives in the expressions we still use without knowing their origin, in the stories we still tell about things that happen in the dark, in the cemetery watchman, pacing his rounds through the sleeping city, listening, just listening, and in those two words scratched into the dust of a sealed vault, 600 years ago, by a woman who wanted nothing more than for someone to know the truth about her. Ero viva. I was alive. She was. And so are we. And tonight, as you settle into the dark and the quiet, and the world grows still around you, remember her. Remember all of them. And maybe, just maybe, appreciate, more than you might have an hour ago, the particular and irreplaceable gift of being able to feel the weight of your own blanket, the sound of your own breath, the simple, extraordinary miracle of knowing, without any doubt at all, that you are here, that you are present, that you are alive. Sleep well. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, thank you. Genuinely, truly, thank you. These stories deserve to be heard. The people in them deserve to be remembered. And if you found this video interesting, if it kept you awake in the best possible way, please consider sharing it with someone who loves history, or medicine, or the strange places where both of them meet the deepest fears of being human. Leave a comment about which case or which detail hit you hardest. And if you want more bedtime history, more stories from the quiet corners of the past that most textbooks don't have room for, subscribe. We'll be here, in the dark, listening.